And there we go. Okay, welcome. Well, welcome to the new year for a start. Um, Hope you all managed to have a break. Happy New Year, everybody. And today's session, we are very lucky to have Sandy Turner and Nick from the Link. They will go into detail of kind of how it all works, but they're the provision within Sutton that support in a more intense way the children who have a demand avoidant profile. So I know that's something that's been raised by a lot of the autism leads in terms of kind of how the strategies might differ from the kind of classical autism. Um, so yeah, we're very lucky to have them here today talking in detail, and they'll also give you some signposting of kind of further resources. We've only got an hour, so I thought it's best if they just do their talk and then further kind of specific questions about pupils, you can either come along to an autism advice session or maybe contact them directly. Um, so if I hand over to you guys, keep putting your names in the chat if you've just arrived. You're sharing your own screen, aren't you? Yeah. Do I need to enable you to do that, or can you?
I think I'm all right,
Okay, good.
as long as everybody can see that.
Yep, I can.
Are we okay? Good.
Lovely. Yep.
Okay, so yes, thank you very much for inviting us. I'll just quickly just say something about myself. It's quite good to know who's speaking to you. So I'm Sandy Turner. As you know, I'm the principal at the Link School. I have quite a lot of experience with uh, children and adults with autism. So I have family members with autism myself. So it's very much lived experience. Also, I've been working with children with autism for about the last 37 years, I think. So I've got lots of things in my toolbox, but particularly over the last 10 years or so, I've had the experience of working with a number of young people with a more demand avoidant type of autism. And that's both in the classroom as well, so as a practitioner, but also as a leader. And I think you'll probably know, all of you, that if you work with children with this profile, that it is a very different experience, and you need a completely different sort of set of tools. So I'm just going to ask Nick actually if you can just change it so I can see people as well.
Yeah.
Because
When I put it in, you disappear. So we'd rather see you if that's all right.
Yeah, I find it hard to talk to people I can't see, so that's good. The latest research tells us that 70% of pupils with this profile are actually out of school, not receiving any kind of education at all, which is a terrible statistic. But I suppose what we want to come to with today really is just to say to you that it doesn't really have to be like that. Um, and there are things that that we can put in place that makes the school environment accessible to a lot of children with this profile. Not all, but an awful lot. So that's what we want to do. We want to try and focus on on your situation in primary settings as well as much as we can. Nick, is there anything you want to say to introduce yourself?
No, just really to introduce myself. I'm Nick. I'm the head of the two satellite sites. So that's our primary satellite up on Brownshaw, and our cottage secondary site down near Carew. I've worked with young people with SEN since I was about 12. I used to volunteer and do holidays, and then I got into being a teaching assistant, and then followed it through to my teaching and into management. And one of my passions is to work with young people around their well-being and their behaviours that challenge or of concern. So I've been working with our students with PDA probably around about 7 years, but head of site for the last 3.
Yeah, and certainly the children are our main teachers, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely.
Definitely. So we've all, started off doing courses like this, but it's certainly the experience that's given us the strategies. So we'll just look at quickly what we're going to cover. So briefly, we'll talk about what demand avoidance is, but for the majority of the time, we want to talk about the approaches that can be used, because I think those are the things that you really want to find out about. And then we'll signpost you to some further support. So first of all, what is PDA? A lot of people say, is it autism? Isn't it autism? Currently, it does come under the umbrella of autism. So it's an autism condition. There isn't a separate diagnosis yet for PDA in the health manuals, but it seems to be becoming more and more recognised. Certainly through EHCPs, you'll often see now a diagnosis of autism with a demand avoidant profile. Occasionally you get pathological demand avoidance that has been diagnosed, but that's quite often through a private assessment. So so it's an autism condition. Children do share common elements with ASD, particularly difficulties with social communication and those restrictive patterns of behaviour that we often see. But the key difference is that children have an anxiety-driven need to avoid everyday demands and expectations, and that includes things that they enjoy. They struggle to do more than once, because if they've enjoyed it can then become a demand that they're expected to enjoy it as much another time, and then they find that they can't actually do those things that they enjoy, so it becomes quite extreme. The children tend to use more social approaches to avoid those demands. One of the questions you might ask yourself is what I'm seeing, is it PDA or demand avoidance, or is it something else? And one of the ways that we've found to identify children when we go out as part of our outreach service, when we're trying to differentiate between ASD and demand avoidance, or is it trauma or attachment or something else that can look similar, is watching the reaction of the children to any kind of demand. And when we're talking about demands, we're not just talking about direct demands. So obviously there are lots of direct demands, particularly in a school environment, where you have to have consistent expectations in order for a school to run smoothly, or a classroom to run smoothly. So you've got all your direct things that you would ask or say to children about lining up or sitting in particular places. So there are lots of those through the day, but there's also a lot of subtle demands that we may not think about. So even things like at lunchtime, there might be sort of dinner smells coming through the corridors, which you might not think about, but for a child with demand avoidance, that's immediately a demand that, oh my goodness, lunchtime's coming, there's going to be another transition that I might not be able to manage. Things like bells, a lot of schools have bells for transitions, and again that becomes a demand for children of this profile. And then apart from the subtle demands, you've also got something that we call silent demands. And again, these are things that you see all the time in schools. So as part of a lesson, obviously, teachers often ask questions. But a question is a silent demand because the expectation is that you answer that. Most classes have timetables or some kind of schedule. And again, if that's prominent in the classroom, you don't have to say that that's the expectation, but you can see, or the child can see from the visual, that it's an expectation, so that becomes demand. Lots of social games or rules in games that you might play as part of the lessons that you've prepared. again, those rules are silent demands. You know, a lot of the more behavioural approaches that we might use as part of our teaching, sort of rewards and sanctions that we have in schools. They you know, present challenges and demands for the children as well. So they're constant. Well, as soon as they come into school, they're constantly bombarded by demands all day long, which is quite often why their anxiety and their behaviour increases as the day progresses, and why a lot of the children can't manage to get through the whole day. And it's also why, you know, why these children, a lot of them are not accessing school for a variety of reasons. So these are some of the typical barriers. So the most obvious one is the work task avoidance that you will see. And again, that can be different for different children. So we often talk about the fight, flight, freeze and fawn responses. So, you know, there are children that just freeze and just refuse to do what they're being asked to do. They might just sit there, they might sit under the table, they might just ignore you. So you can't get anything done, but they're not being particularly disruptive. So we find those are the children that tend to last longer, particularly in a mainstream setting, or they last longer in, you know, just in education on the whole. But then you get the children that have the fight flight responses, and obviously that's much more difficult to manage. And I'm sure, you know, a lot of you are finding that in your settings. So children that are trying to escape out of school, hiding, you know, so that you can't find them, or they're showing aggressive behaviours and hurting other children, hurting themselves, self-injurious behaviour, hurting staff. And
Sorry, Sandy. Somebody just asked a question, and I'm not sure if
yeah,
they can see the PowerPoint. Can everybody else see it? Yeah,
oh,
everyone else can. Okay.
right, okay.
Carry on.
Yes, I'm sure a lot of you are seeing this and, you know, trying to balance the needs of the other children that, you know, that you're supporting, alongside children that are presenting with some challenging and dangerous behaviour and all the risks around that. And it is extremely difficult, which is why it's such a hard job to manage the needs of these children in your settings. So another typical barrier you'll see is perfectionism. So these children on the whole want to get it right, but again, that becomes demand, and that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from. And, you know, you'll notice that a lot of the children will self-sabotage. So they'll make something go wrong on purpose, or they'll tear up their work. They're quite frightened of being praised for something that they've done well. So to avoid that happening, they sabotage before they get to that place. Quite often the children are very impulsive. So although you may do a lot of work on trying to support them to make right choices, in the moment they're not able to do that. Quite a few children have a dual diagnosis as well. We're finding that a lot of children with a demand avoidant profile also have an ADHD diagnosis. So yeah, you know, you're trying to manage and put in strategies around the ADHD as well, which makes it a lot more complex. Quite a lot of the children are overly sensitive. They tend to hold on to things, things that have happened, so they will have very negative feelings towards other children or staff members, and can be very reactive to very little things that might happen, and when there's a lot of children around, you can't avoid those kind of things happening. And that leads to difficulty, obviously, sustaining relationships with peers and with staff as well. So those are the sort of typical barriers that you would see. So we're just going to go on to what makes a good approach to working with a child with demand avoidant traits. And we'll try and focus on things that will support in a school setting as opposed to home or somewhere else. We find this is very useful. I don't know whether you've seen this. So this is from the PDA Society. This is their acronym for PANDA. So their icon is a panda, and they've chosen that because pandas in the wild need a very specific kind of environment in which to thrive. And that's very similar to our children with a PDA profile. They need a very specific environment in which to thrive as well. But these are the key areas in terms of strategies that really support children with PDA and give them the best chance of success. So the P is for pick your battles, which is really about minimising rules and giving choices. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Then we've got anxiety management, and that's obviously so important because the condition is an anxiety-driven condition. Then N is for negotiation and collaboration, which is very much a joint approach to working if we're going to be successful. How to disguise and manage demands, and then adaptation, which is really about how we adapt our own behaviours. So I'm going to just look at the first two, and then Nic will do the last three. So this is a very important strategy. This is one that we find helps us to be successful when we can be consistent about where we're going to pick our battles with young people. So there's sort of three things really to look at. So out of all the kind of demands that a child has to manage and the kind of things that we put in, it's important to think about, what are the demands that we're putting in every day, first of all. And then we need to think about what's the priority for the child to follow that demand. So things that are high priority are those things that are non-negotiable. But there has to be a decision that's made across the team as to what's included in that. Because one of the dangers is that one staff member will think something's a high priority and another one will think that's a low priority. So you do have to actually sort of sit down with your team and work out what's what. So the high priorities are non-negotiable. Then you've got the desirable but not essential. So ideally these are things that we'd like to see, but if the child's not up to it on that particular day, we're not going to really press it. And then you've got the low priority, which are the things that are negotiable. So we'll just show you how we do that. This is an example, but that we sometimes use when we're doing training. But because we haven't got lots of time today, I just want to think about your setting and the children that you're working with, or the child that you're working with. And then maybe look at some of these school demands and have a think about, where you would put them. At your school, does every child have to wear school uniform? Is that a high priority? Is it desirable but not essential? Are you able to adapt the uniform, or is it going to be a low priority? You're not going to mind if children don't wear a uniform, and how would you manage that with the rest of the school? So, for example, when we first started at the satellite site, we had at least 2 children that used to come in their onesies. And they did that for quite a long time. They're not doing it now, but they did do it, originally. We probably wouldn't have got them into school if we hadn't allowed them to do that. So, for us, it was a low priority, but it's become desirable but not essential now. So, attending assemblies, what's that like in your school? Is that high desirable or low? Sitting in a planned seating pattern, and there's quite a few schools that do that. That's not something that works well for a child with PDA. Would that still be a high priority? Going to the playground at set play times. Again, that can be quite a big demand for some children if they're expected to go at exactly the same time as everybody else. Doing homework, where does that sit? Staying in the classroom. A lot of our children with PDA really struggle to work in a classroom environment. Where does that sit? Would you be prepared to have a separate place that is their own? Is there a space for them to work outside the classroom that they can go to when they need to? Is there a place that can be their base? And so you turn it around the other way, and they come into the class when they're able to cope, but they stay in their space the majority of the time. Or are you aiming for them to be in the classroom the whole time? Where do all these things sit? If the fire alarm goes off, responding to the fire alarm, if it's a fire drill, where does that sit in terms of priorities? Staying on the school premises. So there are some, aren't there, that are really obvious, obviously high priority. And those tend to be the things that are for safety for the young person. So, staying on the school premises would be one. Responding to a fire alarm, if particularly if it's a real fire, obviously that's a high priority, and you have to then insist that the child does that thing. So it's good sometimes just to see it like this and think about it, in your setting and what you're prepared to accept and what you can be flexible with. Because if there's one thing these children need, it's flexibility. And the more flexible we can be, and the environment that we present to them, the more flexible that can be, the more likely it is to work. So let's just go on to anxiety management. Again, this is so important because the children are, racked with anxiety a lot of the time. I mean, I kind of describe it as, if you think about something that you that you get very anxious about and how that feels. I used to hate exams, but for years and years I used to have nightmares around exam time. I think even into my 40s, it used to get to about June, and I'd find that I was dreaming that I was in an exam, and I think it was because I hated them so much when I was younger, and that's that kind of constant feeling of anxiety is what children are feeling all of the time. So, how do we reduce that for them? So, one of the things we try to do is reduce uncertainty, and by that I don't mean with the strategies that we would normally use for children with autism in terms of providing schedules so that they know what they're doing. It's more about expectations in terms of what they can expect from staff behaviour and the way staff are going to be towards them. Was there something else because you're really good at this?
I think it's around having a conversation as well. about what's happening, not necessarily putting a schedule or a timetable in, but mentioning this is going to happen today, and then inviting the young person to ask when that might happen rather than telling, and putting that schedule in. We found that works really, really well.
And then thinking ahead, it's making sure that you're aware of what's likely to be a problem for those young people. So rather than having to respond when something triggers them, that you already know what that's going to be, and you've already got your plan A, B, or C in place when that happens. Knowing the students' current and historical triggers which affect their anxiety is really important. So it's taking that time when you first get to know a child, when a child comes into the school, to really check out those things that are causing anxiety, so you're responding and understanding the right things about them, and then recognizing the anxiety attack that they might have, and being able to support them in the moment, and then move on afterwards. So and it's struggle with it a lot at our satellite sites, trying to start again. It's a new hour, it's a new lesson, it's a new day. How do you do that mentally, and I suppose emotionally, whilst being aware of the fact that you still want to be supporting that young person to manage their behaviour in a different way, and you still want to be challenging some things. So you've got that on the one hand, but on the other hand, you want to make sure that you go in with the attitude, we're starting again, and it's okay. So there are. This is something, a strategy that we use constantly, and it's one of the things that we found to be most effective. And it's we call it sort of a demand anxiety seesaw. So rather than having a set way of working, or particular strategies that you might put in, when A happens, do this, and this will have this effect or impact. Rather than having that, it's a much more sort of flexible approach. So with this, you need to know what the young person looks like when they're in an anxious state, but also when their anxieties are low. And every single child is different. So you need to think, what do they, what's their facial expression like? How do they move? What do they say? What do they do when their anxieties are low? What changes when they're bubbling? And then what do they look like when they're in a high anxiety state? And that will look very different from a child that's a freeze responder to a child that's a fight-flight responder. But to make sure those are captured and written down and understood by everybody is key to start with. And then the way the anxiety seesaw works is to see when they've got low anxiety, and then you can put in more demands when they're like that. But when they're bubbling, you have to reduce the demands. So high anxiety, low demand, and then low, bubbling, sort of bubbling anxiety. Again, the demands need to be reduced, as the anxiety increases. So sometimes we use the seesaw to explain that. Sometimes a cooker or dials. If the anxiety is high, the dial is high, the demand is low. I know Nick's personal favourite is the gaming, where actually I'll let you just describe.
So this was one of my staff. This is the way they represented it in their own head. if you are a gamer and you're playing a game and you've got lots of life left, you're a little bit more daring and you take more risks. Whereas if you've got a little bit of life left, you tend to be much more cautious and draw back. And members of staff likened it very much to how you might approach what risks you might take when putting demands in.
Right, I'm going to let Nic carry on from now on.
So as Sandy said, anxiety management is a fluctuating thing. And just because something worked well yesterday in class doesn't mean that it will be repeated or it will be successful next time. And that comes round again to the anxiety management. It comes down to many factors and processes that affect that anxiety, affect the autonomy that the young person is feeling and the control that they've got. So it may well be that you've got a student that yesterday was able to come into PE and follow all the demands, but today it's not working. And what's really going through our young people's heads sometimes in those moments is, will it be the same? And what if it is or isn't? If it's the same, it could be boring and that brings anxiety if I don't know how I'll react. Or if it isn't the same, how am I going to react? What if I'm not as successful as I was last time? Especially if they've received, our students have actually spoken to us and said, I find it hard when I get praise. It means I've got to do it well again. Also, if it's something around their interests, why do they want to share that with anybody? Because it's their interest and they don't want to share that. And also, we do hear from a lot of our students is, well, I've done it once before, so why have I got to do it again? And am I just doing it to make you happy? So it's considering those things sometimes, that anxiety management is a real fluctuating thing. So celebrate the successes when they happen, and just be aware that sometimes it will be a really difficult task for that young person to do again. So we spend a lot of our time using negotiation and collaboration. And our biggest thing is to keep calm and be proactive with our students. And we try to use collaboration to solve problems. So we follow a strategy called ALSUP, which we'll direct you and tell you about later, signpost you towards a good book. But it's about allowing our young people to feel that they've got some autonomy and control in decisions that are made. So we often will sit down and say, I can see there's a problem here, tell me about it, and get some more information from the young person's perspective. Because as they keep telling me, I'm old. As an old person, I can't understand what they're thinking. And so I always say to them, well, tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what the problem is. And then from there, we can try to negotiate to solve a problem, or we can work collaboratively. So it might be that I suggest a few ideas and that young person chooses the best option. So I'm still giving a lot of choice and control. But it may be that we have to negotiate one of those choices. So it might be that we say, we'll do this for 10 minutes, and then it eventually becomes 7 because we've met in the middle. But also, we need to look at the fairness. A lot of our students are really aware, a lot of our demand avoidance students are aware about fairness, and is it fair that they're doing that and other people aren't? Is it fair that other people are doing that and they aren't? Trying to balance that fairness. But one of the biggest things really that comes round with our students is the trust. So if you've said you're going to do something, you do it. Because it's the connection and the trust that builds the ease of collaborating. And we're very honest with our young people. They actually understand logical consequences and logical reasoning. And we have to say it's okay for us to be wrong and admit it as adults that we do get it wrong. I also use getting things wrong. My ears don't work very well quite often. If I've said something or I haven't heard something, it is, sorry, I didn't hear you, my ears don't work very well. It's a really simple trick to actually give that control back to our students. So disguising and managing our demands, as Sandy sort of has said, quite often we use indirect demands. So we might speak to somebody else and say, wouldn't it be great if we did this? it'd be great if that happened. So actually, when you've got a class of other students, you can direct to the students in the class, and you're not directing directly at your young person with demand avoidance. They might find that much more reassuring. Thinking about where you put your word positioning. Also thinking about making a demand completion not seem like a big deal. So it might be you ask the demand as you walk away. So you're not continuing to see if that they do it. So it's like, yeah, I know you're going to do it. And the young person will feel less pressure. As we said about matching the demand with the anxiety, or sometimes doing it together. A lot of my staff are really rubbish at their multiplication tables, and they forget how to do that. And our students like to prove that they know it and that the teacher or the teaching assistant doesn't. So that sort of challenge sometimes is quite reassuring for our young people.
Can we just go back to word
course you can.
positioning for the moment? Could you just explain what word positioning means?
So it's thinking about where you put the words in the sentence for the young person. So what is the highest part of the demand that you're going to put in? You don't want to end on the highest part of demand or the highest pressure. And quite often we find with a lot of our students just saying thank you rather than please is a much better way. So the thank you is just, I know you're going to do it and I trust in you because we've got that relationship. If you're asking a question, there is an option to say no. So it's thinking, but not the way that you do it is very much in the nonchalant, I know it's going to happen. Anything else you wanted to add about word positioning?
Yeah, that's good, thank you.
So we use an activity and approach that is called backdoor learning, really. And it's been likened by a lot of people to EYFS kind of model, but it does work as well with paperwork, etc. So it's a technique that works really well to support and disguise the curriculum demand in our interests of our young people. And I know we said earlier, you have to be careful. If you get too excited about what the young person is excited about, they might switch off from it because they don't want to share it. But it's based on trust. There's no traditional expectation of them answering, but it's a discussion that's shared. So quite often start backdoor learning approach with asking our young people to tell us something about what they know. It allows connection to take place, and it reduces the demand on just that student. And the approach is easy for parents as well to adapt at home. So it's something you can tell the parents to support with. So one way is to set an activity up and show no interest in it and allow the young person to explore it themselves. And then you join in. Be flexible to where the learning happens. Be prepared to veer away from your initial expectations. I can remember starting to talk to a young man about a football match. Then we got into countries. Then we ended up talking about the Cold War. So we went off and but there was lots of learning through that. When you don't bring those expectations, when you do bring them out, don't bring things out and set them up and leave them out because that demand of them being there, bring them out last minute and be quite nonchalant about what's out. Do you want to have a go? No, okay. Don't feel like it's the end of the world and don't lose heart if an activity gets destroyed. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what questions we could ask to get the outcomes we want or extend the learning. And one activity we found, especially we've got a high proportion of staff, which I know a lot of you are not lucky enough to have. But our teaching assistants need to come along that journey with us. And so we did an activity to work with our staff around how could we bring in backdoor learning in different curriculum areas without showing them the national curriculum because we challenged them. And this is sort of an idea of what that came back like. So staff had to do a lucky dip of what subject they were going to ask questions about. And this one was around buses, because we had a young man that was really interested in buses. But if you tried to present too much with buses, he would switch off. So for English, we started to talk about where the bus was going. Can you help me spell bus? Look at the number, what information there is, what bus stop is that? And this young man will now, if I say, where's that bus going? He'll find me the bus on an iPad and then tell me what bus it is, tell me what bus stop that is. And his English and his speech has really come out. Science, we'd looked at lots of different things of gravity and forces. So it's all questions that develop the learning, but without putting too much demand. Always good if you know the answer to your question as well. In case the young person doesn't answer, you can then teach. But when it comes to things like Minecraft, I have to admit, our young people are the tutors and they teach us. But it's fascinating to hear, and then we can have philosophical questions around that and debates, which I don't think we could have done without the backdoor learning. We've got lots of examples of those, if anybody would like us to send some out. So adaptation, we have to adapt to our young people. Now, some of our young people really appreciate humour, some don't. So we have to know our young person quite well. Some of our young people are very sarcastic and use humour themselves. And actually, if you get a nickname from one of our students, you know you've got a good connection. We use distraction. So when things are difficult and anxiety is rising, we may distract to something that the student prefers. We quite often use novelty, so something brand new, something very innovative, or something that really captures the young people's imagination. We do find that a lot of students with demand avoidance are really into role play as well. And even up to, I would say, into their early teens, some of our students have been continued into role play. And actually, we've got a Dungeons and Dragons club on a Monday. So we have to be flexible, as we talked about all the way through. We need to allow plenty of time. And we have a plan B, but as you said earlier, it's plan B. And what if plan B doesn't work? It's about being confident. Because our young people are already in a high state of anxiety. They're trying to get autonomy and control, and they need us as adults to support them and be able to say it's okay. And if we don't know what our next step is, they won't have, it will only raise their anxiety. So getting support, there's the PDA Society, lots of books, lots of articles, social media, there are parent support groups, and I can't recommend things on Facebook and Instagram, but I know there's some really sort of poignant people working out there with some really key evidence. So worth searching on social media, actually. As we said, on the PDA Society, one of our lifelines at the beginning, really, there is a EHCP exemplar that the PDA Society have produced, and it helps to look at how you would set provision, what types of outcomes you could set, and it ranges right from students that are able to collaborate right down to students that aren't. There's lots of, I would say at times it looks a little bit contradictory. It's not, it's designed so it fits students to be flexible.
It is an excellent document. I know
It adds a lot to parents.
Yeah, definitely. And I've seen a real change over the last 6 years, I suppose. Initially we were getting consultations for children that you could tell they were a PDA profile from the section B strengths, the strengths and needs, and then you'd get down to the section F with the provision, and the provision was very much similar to the kind of provision that you would see for a child with autism in terms of structures, PECS, teach structures. rewards and sanctions, that kind of thing. So the provision was not matching the need, but just because they had a autism diagnosis, they were they were filled in the provision section with very good strategies, evidence-based strategies that work really well for a child that's typically a child with typical autism. But those strategies, they not only don't work for children with PDA, but they exacerbate the anxiety around the demand avoidance. And I really feel that's why so many placements were breaking down, because a lot of professionals were really trying to do the best thing. We're all trying to do the best thing for the children. So, they were diligently putting in place the provision in section F, but that was causing more problems for the child, and things were, breaking down more rapidly. And that's why this document is such a good one, because it really does present all of the strategies that really work for a child with the demand avoidant profile. So if you haven't seen that, I would definitely get a copy of it.
And you can find that easily on PDA Society. So useful reading material that we've come across over the time. There's probably many more that we've come across as well. But our Bible was the Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome in Children. And then our students have taught us a lot more since then. And there's a teacher's introduction to PDA. A lovely book here of Can I Tell You About PDA Syndrome? And we've come across a lot of these books, haven't we, where they're written from a student's perspective. And then The Explosive Child is really what we've been using for our well-being. It looks at well-being for our students, looks at how we can support their emotional intelligence and development. And it's all very much distant to zones of regulation. A lot of our students, we found, had zones of regulation written onto their section F, and I've worked it and I've seen it be successful. But for some reason with our demand avoidance students, we found it wasn't working as well. And then we came to the realization that our students felt a pressure to always get back to the green zone. Didn't matter how much we told them it was okay to be angry, or it was okay to feel excited or upset. They constantly felt they just had to be in the green zone. And they couldn't really see beyond that. So they found that really difficult. So the Explosive Child works to look at lagging skills and unsolved problems, and to solve them together with the student. And I've seen we've made that work really successfully with so many of our students. It's that will tell me what's wrong and let's work it out together approach. On our website as well, we've got accessible practitioner research, which is research that we've done, our teachers have done, alongside our students, and we've published. So feel free, we've got a PDA hub, haven't we, on our website. And I would say the only other thing we haven't talked about in terms of reaching out and getting support is that we do fishbowl mornings as well.
Yeah. So those are once a term. We've started to try and introduce the second one for professionals that have been to an original fishbowl, and that gives you a bit more of an opportunity to talk about individual children, or perhaps things that you've taken back and you've tried that are starting to work or aren't working, and you can't work out why they're not working for that child, and it's a little bit more bespoke. So there's opportunities hopefully for those as well. So that's a very quick overview. Rebecca, have we got time for any questions, do you think?
Yeah, we've got probably just under 10 minutes. So yeah, if people do have questions with the fishbowl, so I hadn't heard of that term before. Did you say it was monthly or term?
No, we didn't termly.
Termly. Yeah. And that's kind of to come to the school, have like a bit of time to sort of wander around, isn't it? And then chat to you guys.
Yeah, we look at because some of our children are integrated fully into class groups up at the secondary site, and there are other children that have a class base at the secondary site, but they integrate for particular sessions. And then we've got our satellite sites for those children that are not really at a stage of being able to integrate. So you're able to sort of come and see the different stages and the different kinds of children and the different approaches. But it's very much, even those ones we try to tailor it to the people that come along. What's their situation, because obviously that comes has got a child with demand avoidance, one or more. Trying to understand what the challenges are, and the hope is that that you can come along and take some of the things that you see and think about whether it's possible to adapt them for the setting that you're in.
Yeah, I wondered if some of the questions might be around that, kind of adapting it to mainstream. So over to you guys, autism leads. If you've got any, you might have a specific student in mind or a question around some of the sort of strategies or provision. You can write them in the chat as well if you don't want to verbally ask out loud. I know while people are thinking, that's a question like I often hear, is that kind of like when you're saying about school uniform, for example, or assemblies, like, well, we couldn't do that in our school, like we couldn't not have a school uniform. What's your kind of or they have to go to assembly, it's part of, it's part of what we do here. What is your sort of response to that, I guess?
Yeah, I suppose it's a decision that has to be made at senior leadership level, I think. It's you've got to kind of put your neck out and think, do we really want to be able to do something for these children? Because if we do, then there has got to be some adaptation. And it's not trying not to be frightened about that adaptation. It's not going to suddenly make all the other children
Send into anarchy.
yeah, that's right. Become anarchists. It just doesn't happen like that. And in fact, what we find is that the other young people grow their understanding. We know autism is a hidden disability, and so is PDA. But by talking about those differences and getting permission, obviously the child and the parent often have to give permission to be open about what the need is. But if you can do that and the other children have understanding, then they're very accepting usually. And we found that when we had a lot of children at our primary site that moved to our secondary site, and the secondary site hadn't any experience of children with PDA, and they were very anxious at first because that's what they thought. So they suddenly thought, oh, these children are going to come in, they're not going to respond to the normal expectations that we have. It's going to cause problems for the other children. And it really hasn't. We've got a lot of children now that are based at the annex there and are integrated. And I think it has been about being open and honest around, the young person's barriers and needs. Because once the other children understand, they're very accepting. But it has to be a definite decision.
Yeah.
I was going to add, some of the adaptation doesn't need to be necessarily it isn't done. So a student could stand outside the doors of assembly, so they're not having the anxiety of having to go in with everybody. Or I think we found really in lockdown, could a computer be set up so that they're watching assembly on Zoom, so they're still part of it, but they're away and they're in a much less anxious state. So there's lots of adaptations and little steps that might be possible to support that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful. I think, like you said, it's the importance of kind of getting that senior leadership sort of involvement, which can be tricky sometimes depending on your settings. And I think with your roles as well, just generally as autism leads, I know some leads have said to us that they are kind of finding it hard maybe to get opportunities to share this information within your school setting. So it's just kind of a reminder, and let us know if that is an issue for your particular school, because we can get in touch with Senkos and leadership and things, because the idea is really that you're getting this information, but you're then able to share it across your schools, whether that's, in staff meetings or emails and a bit of both. And again, ideally, you get the opportunity to maybe be released from class and then kind of maybe go to meetings with the Senko, or if somebody, like I was coming into school to observe a child as from an autism advisory teacher perspective, you could then like join me to do a joint observation. So just kind of reminding you of that as well, because sometimes we have these lovely ideas, but they're not we're not able to kind of take them to the next level. So you're kind of having to be those advocates as well for our young people. But yeah, somebody's commented, coming from someone who has taught a child with PDA, this training was really good. I wish I'd had it whilst I was teaching him, which is really nice. Another question, would you mention the demand avoidance directly to the child in order to work with them to find a possible solution? So, example, I've noticed you don't like it when, or I think you might find it tricky when, or what could we do to make it easier, or would drawing attention directly to it make it worse?
I think that comes down to knowing your young person. I've certainly been able to have that conversation when the trust and connection is there. I've noticed that you don't like it when that happens. Am I right in thinking that? So not saying that they're definitely doing it, but am I right? Is that how you feel? And quite often they'll reply with a yes or a no, and they may say no because they don't want to talk about it. So it's, quite often listening. And one of the biggest things I would say is listening to their point of view, even if you know that point of view is completely, no, I wouldn't say completely wrong, but it isn't necessarily the truth. Being able to acknowledge that and say, okay, I understand that's what you're feeling, that's what you're thinking. Let me go and fact check and find out some more information. So really sort of coming alongside our young people, and acknowledging that they've got a voice. I think sometimes drawing attention to it for some young people can make it worse, but it needs to be in a setting when they're relaxed and calm. So, it might be those ELSA sessions, if there's any chance of that, or some wellbeing session.
Well, one of the strategies that we use is something called a running commentary. So for those children that can't bring themselves to talk about what the problem is, but what it is through observation, is perhaps to have a conversation with another professional within their hearing, because one of the things that our children are so good at is absorbing information from their environment. We always say with some of our children, we're amazed at how well they read and how good their comprehension is, and because they've not they haven't learned those things from traditional ways of teaching, because they don't learn that way, but they're learning them somehow, and they seem to absorb information just through very careful observation. So quite often, just have two people having that conversation in the corner about a situation that you want that young person to maybe understand a little bit better. They will, they will draw on that, and they haven't been part of it because that's gone in the corner, but they've been present, and that's quite often a strategy that we use with those that aren't at that stage of being able to say, did you find that? I noticed that you found that tricky, or whatever, you've noticed it for them, and put something in place.
Thank you. And I think, like you said, that it's about knowing the young person, but if you can have those conversations in possibly quite a long time after the event, maybe, but just reflecting back, is really useful if they can then get to know themselves better, and then obviously self advocate for themselves as well going forward. Thank you. So again, another comment. Thank you very much for an informative session. I've made many notes. Sounds like lots of useful feedback, which is great. I've obviously got the slides, and we'll have the recording from today, and I've made a few kind of key notes that I'll send out to all the autism leads. And I've included your website with the hub stuff that you were talking about. And then also people can sign up if they are interested in the fishbowl termly events. Probably useful to implement some of these strategies, and then it could be you kind of sign up to that later on to see if there's things you're like, oh, I'm not quite sure how to tweak this to make it work. But yeah, thank you so much, Nic and Sandy, for giving up your
Pleasure.
time this afternoon. I think it's really useful for supporting all of our other Sutton schools. I'll send evaluation form again in the email. But thank you all for your time, and hope the rest of this term so far goes well. Take care, everybody.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
very much, Rebecca.
That's all
Bye.
right.
Bye.
Thanks for coming. Bye bye.